It's time for the chip race.
For our strategy piece this week, I had a fascinating hand at the recent UK Tour Nottingham event, sponsored of course by our sponsors Unibet Poker. We were there. It was a lovely event, first of all, a bit of a family affair, lots of regulars on the UK Tour scene. Of course, inevitably I had to get myself embroiled into a pot with a fellow ambassador, namely in this instance Diva Byrne. Diva, a player for whom I hugely respect and certainly fear went out of position against her as I was in this hand. Basically, the hand took place. A serial limper limped at big blind 400. No ante in the game yet. There are no antes in those games until a little later on. So he limps in for 400. I isolate him from the cutoff to 1400. Diva flats the button. And when it gets round to him, we have two folds from the blinds. It gets round to him and he calls as well. So there's about maybe, let's say, 5k in the middle, give or take. And the flop comes down 9-7-6 with the 9-7 of clubs. It goes check, and Diva bets 1500. My limping opponent calls, and I also call. Dara, what do you make of it so far?
Yeah, it seems reasonably standard. This was quite a dramatic hand. It happened just before a break, I remember, and even a crowd gathered around because Diva had a huge decision on the river, obviously. And
spoiler alert.
Sorry, but yeah, I think you described the guy as a serial limper, so that means that your range is super wide for isolating this player. So that's the first interesting thing about the hand, that the fact that your range is very wide. Then Diva decides to flat in position behind you. Now her range is a lot more condensed than your range. By condensed I mean she probably doesn't have very many really strong hands, because she also recognized the situation that you were basically isolating a limper. So she would have raised with her really strong hands. She I think she would have balanced that out too by also like raising some hands like low suited aces, so they're probably not in her range. So Diva's range is sort of like strong but not brilliant hands, probably like decent hands up to 8s or 9s. I think 10s and above she would start to 3-bet you, and then the bigger aces as well she would also 3-bet. So her range is sort of like hands that are worse than those hands she would 3-bet, but she's also not calling with absolute junk, so she has quite a narrow range.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the premium hands 3-bet me. I think maybe some weaker ace blocker hands, king blocker hands might 3-bet me as well. So I do strongly feel in this spot like she might have some small to medium pairs. She could have some good Broadway cards, some suited middly cards, that kind of stuff that flops well. And then, of course, she'll have plans to float me as well and take pots away from me even when we both miss type of situations. In terms of our limping opponent, man, he could have really anything. I was playing with that guy for a couple of hours. No disrespect to him, he's a recreational player, but he just loved to come in for a limp. Only once did he come in for a limp raise. Most of the time was limp calling, and then of course that's very easy to play against. You can just see bet and maybe fire again on turns and take pots away from him. So don't really know where he's at the moment, but of course on a middly board such as the one that's come down on the flop, the 9-7-6 with two clubs, a lot of draw possibilities. Pretty much the kind of flop where it's hard to miss.
Yeah, and I think the flop kind of hits Diva's range pretty hard, because we said like her a lot of her aces and her big card hands are going to 3-bet you, so they're not in the range. Her range is sort of has a lot of middly cards in it, so she could pretty much have all the sets, and she can have like a lot of flush draws and straight draws and straights even. So she hits the board kind of harder than either of you two. Obviously the limper could have almost anything, but that by virtue of the fact that he has almost anything means he usually has almost nothing, because when you're playing any two cards you do miss any board. There's no one board that's better for you when your range is that wide. So I think in terms of a range advantage, Diva probably has the range advantage at this point, and then your range is wider, but also more high card heavy.
I think that's completely fair. Now, looking at the turn brings an offsuit 5, which means 10-8 is the nuts, any 8 is a straight, and of course we still have that club draw from the flop. It goes check again. Diva has the option to bet, and she decides in this instance to bet 3k, which is roughly again a 1/3 pot bet. I think the pot is about 9,500 or so. My limping opponent, much as you predicted, Dara, has a bit but not a good enough bit, and he lets it go, and I flat call, making the pot roughly, I would say, 15k going to the river. Now, how do you analyse this situation?
This is a very good spot for Diva to keep barreling it, almost irrespective of her hand, because even though the draw gets there, essentially the nature of the board hasn't changed. Her range advantage on the flop has now been reinforced on the turn because she has a lot more ace in her range than you have.
Makes sense.
As a proportion of her range, so she will have the straight more often. If she has a club flush draw, she should keep barreling and try and get you to fold hands that were just being sticky once, and she might hit her flush on the river and win that way. And like into two opponents, I don't think Diva is betting with absolutely nothing on the flop. So like whatever she had on the flop, she still has on the turn. Makes
sense. Okay, so we go to a river. It's obviously already juiced up nicely from flop and turn bets, and the river comes the 6 of clubs, pairing the board, pairing bottom pair from the flop, and of course bringing in the club draws to make flushes as well. I take a couple of moments and then overbet the pot shove for her effective stack, which is about 17.5k. I think the pot had just shy of 15k, so it's about a 1.2x pot bet. And Diva goes into the tank. Now, at this point, as you described, Dara, the crowd starts circling, the bloggers start coming over and taking interest, and I think it's fair to say I probably started play acting a little bit and acting up to the attention and the cameras. But nonetheless, Diva's faced with a really interesting spot when we now reveal that her hand was Jack 10 of clubs. She's actually rivered the hand she was sort of like semi-bluffing all the way, but now she faces quite maybe a surprising bet.
Yeah, I mean, Diva's in a horrible spot now because she's made her hand on the river, but she's facing an overbet, and it's certainly not the club she wanted on the river because it pairs the board. You do have it's fair to say some hands like 7-6 suited in your range, so you can have a house either by having flop to set, turn to set, or you can have flop 2 pair and turned it into a house in the river. So her flush may not be good. You can also obviously have the nut flush or a better flush. She only has the jack high flush, which is on this board is not particularly strong. So she's actually in a horrible spot now where she has a hand which is strong in the sense that she's made her hand. She has a flush, but it's actually one of the weaker hands she could have in this spot. And and your sizing is so big, she's actually supposed to fold quite a bit of her range. And the question is whether Jack 10 is far enough down that range that it's a fold or not.
Now, the very fact that we are heads up going to the river does mean that there are certain tools available to us which can help with such range analysis and maybe help with our ultimate decision making. Dara, you've done a little bit of work on this for this piece, and I appreciate that, by the way. What can you tell us from that?
Yeah, obviously I spoke to Diva during the break after this hand happened, and she was very unsure about what she was supposed to do on the river, and to be honest, I was unsure as well. It seemed to me like that it was borderline, and I didn't know which side of the border it was going to be. So when I got home, I put the two range. I obviously had the benefit of knowing you two guys, so I knew what your approximate ranges were in these spots. So I put them into a tool called PO Solver. So just opening the file now. What do I call it? Yeah, there we are. Diva versus Donkey Lappin. Yeah.
All right. So there's already a prejudice inbuilt that I misplayed this hand. Okay, go on ahead.
This is the name that we saved after I had analysed the hand, not before.
No. So I'm getting some bad news then, I guess. Okay, here we go.
I found your river bet really mystifying because I couldn't think of any hand that you should play this way, or at least that I felt you should play this way. And the overbet in particular was confusing. So I put it into PO and gave it the option to overbet the river and also to bet a more normal sizing. And PO never overbets the river with any hand. In fact, PO checks its entire range on the river, which is interesting in itself. Which I think is the more natural way to play the hand. Now that said, you have overbet the river, so she has to make a decision on whether to call or not with Jack 10 of clubs. And it's the results are. I found them very interesting, which was that she is supposed to fold her worst flushes, and Jack 10 is one of those worst flushes. So she made a very good fold against your range.
Bravo, Diva. Yeah,
she was far enough down her range, but she's actually supposed to call with her straights. So if she has the 8, she should call.
Now that immediately sounds counterintuitive, Derek. Can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, Pio sometimes does this, and obviously Pio tells you how it would play, but it never explains why. So you kind of have to work that out for yourself. I believe the 8's a really important blocker. I think that's the most. That's the key to why it calls an 8 rather than a club. And the clubs are sort of a reverse blocker in that we want you to be bluffing with the club. So because she has 2 clubs in her hands, that makes it less likely that you are bluffing or continuing with the club. But when she has an 8, it's less likely that you had the straight all along, and she's also blocking some other hands that might be relevant, like 8-6 suited. So yeah, this, even though in absolute hand ranking terms, the flush is stronger than the straight, in this specific spot, the straight is a better call just because it blocks more of your value range. Now, there's a couple of other interesting points about the hand that came out of the analysis. When I spoke to you about the hand, you felt that Diva used too small of a sizing on the turn when she bet.
Yeah, I guess my first read on it was, if you had a flush draw, it's a very good semi-bluff card. You'd want to maybe put a little bit more pain on me here with an overpair, because I kind of figured like maybe after calling the flop, a hand like aces, kings, queens were likely where I wanted to sort of control it. Maybe I wanted to see a safe one come off that didn't flush or straight the board. Obviously that didn't happen, but that was maybe part of my range, and that you'd want to maybe put the most amount of pressure on me to get me to fold that. Although having said that, of course, she would have such a range advantage there that I'd have to relinquish the queens or kings, I feel, in that spot to almost any sizing. Now, the other hands that I would kind of consider there are the ones where I've kind of got a combo draw. Maybe I've got like a pair and a flush draw, or some kind of maybe weak 2 pair that I'm not really sure about. And again, maybe charging those hands a little bit more is a better move. While Diva, of course, does have an 8 in her range, it's not a huge part of her range either. So it felt like a bit of a holding bet to me. Now, of course, you know, Diva may not split her sizings there. She might just decide on one size fits all on the turn. But yeah, to me, it kind of felt like, I'm going to get checked back a lot on the river. That's kind of maybe a defensive holding bet with like a pocket 10s, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting to me when you talk to that, because when I talked to the hand with Diva, she had a completely different perspective. And not to be too insulting or anything, but I think your idea of like betting different amounts on the turn with different holdings is a very dangerous road to go down. I without giving too much away about the way my study buddy plays, but I think she plays very close to game theory optimal, which means that she's going to bet all of the hands in her range with the same sizing, or if she does split her range, all of the ranges will be balanced. She's not going to bet a bigger size with her bluffs to try and get you to fold, and bet a smaller size with her value hands to get you to call.
Similarly, I thought that you could balance out the flush draws with the 8s for a bigger sizing, because then again you're sort of charging me either way.
Yeah, I mean that's possible for sure. And after discussing it with you, I revisited the analysis in Pio, and I gave Pio the option of using 2 different sizings on the turn, the sizing that Diva actually used and the bigger sizing that you recommend. And I'm afraid the bad news is that Pio never chooses the bigger sizing.
Okay.
I think Diva intuited correctly in game that the key to this turn spot is that she has a huge range advantage. And when you have a huge range advantage over your opponent, you can bet a smaller amount because they're basically making a mistake continuing with a lot of hands to that smaller amount. Yeah, I think her turn sizing was spot on, even though she has a hand which obviously she has jack high, and she, you know, if she was just looking at her hand, she's rooting for you to fold. But because of her entire range, she actually wants you to continue with a fairly wide range of weak hands, which you can put more pressure on the river if necessary.
Sure. Well, look, I really strongly feel like I don't want to give away my hand here. I feel like it's part of the mystery of poker to torment your opponents and not give away too much information, or any information if you can get away with it. So I won't say what I had, but I think it's fair to assume I'm pretty polarized on the river when I do take that line. I totally acknowledge acknowledge the analysis of yourself and Pio, and having had the benefit of a bit more time to think through the hand, checking and having a kind of a check calling, check shoving range probably makes a lot more sense with a strong hand, and with maybe some of my weaker holdings too, if I decide I've got the right blockers or the right whatever to make a move and try and steal the pot away. But yeah, as I said, fair to say when I go for the really big overbet sizing on the river, I'm fairly polarized to nutty hands and to bluffs with blockers, if you like. And at the risk of sort of railroading PO, which obviously my play is not PO approved, given that I made the error, I suppose, like, put that in brackets, put it in parenthesis, David makes a bad bet here. Are there worse bad bets that could be made? Are there worse incorrect hands for me to do this with, and better incorrect hands for me to do it with?
Yeah, there are, for sure. I think obviously the fact that you don't reveal your hand it adds to the mystery of the hand, and you've actually given different versions of this. You told Dive immediately after the hand that you had the nut flush with ace two of clubs. She had difficulty believing that, and I had too, to be honest, because first of all, I think those low suited aces are more likely to be called pre-flop rather than raised. So I'm not even sure that they even start in the range. You then disappeared off to the break while we tried to figure out what the hell you had. And my feeling was, at the time, I really couldn't think of a hand that you should play this way. But if I had to put you on a hand, it was a rivered house, which you then decided you got slightly fancy with, and decided you were going to make an overbet and make Diva look silly by calling the overbet. Then you came back from the break and you claimed that you had just the ace of clubs as a blocker, and you had the 9. Ace clubs 9 on the flop would be a bad call. Ace 9 in general would be a bad call because there's so many bad runouts. Having the ace of clubs would be a particularly bad call.
But we already know I'm capable of bad calls here, Dara, so maybe I had that.
Yeah, the reason why it would be a particularly bad call is because now you're blocking so many of her flush draws that are bluffing. So like the ace of clubs is almost the worst card to have at that point. By the time we get to the river, if you had somehow misplayed the previous streets and got to the river with ace 9, which you shouldn't have, then it would actually be a good hand to turn into a bluff at this point, because now having the ace of clubs is actually good because you're blocking all of her flushes, obviously. And the 9 itself has some useful blocker effects in terms of blocking, her houses. She has less pocket 9s, and even a hand like 9-8 suited, you could be blocking that as well, which would be a call on the river to the shove. So I think in terms of the river play, that would be a good hand to turn into a bluff on the river. It's the problem with your river play is it's very difficult to see what hands you should shove for value. Like houses should just be checked and let her continue barreling her misdraws if she has a misdraw, or her flush if she's hit her flush. So it's difficult to work out like why a value hand would shove on the river. Okay,
so in summation, Diva versus Donkey Lappin. Lappin certainly misplayed at least one street, maybe all the streets. We'll never know. I'm going to my grave with this hand, Dara, because I just don't want anyone to know how badly I played it. I think
if you had a house, you probably played it fine until the river. I think if you had anything else, you probably played it atrociously at the river, but might have played it.
Well, look, a fascinating hand. It was fascinating in-game. There was a lot of tomfoolery by me. I think I put myself under my hoodie at one point while she was trying to get a read on me. But with the greatest respect, obviously, a lot of respect for her game. Maybe I got a bluff through her there, or maybe she made a huge hero fold that was correct. What we know regardless is, based on the PO analysis, is she did the right thing and I didn't.
Yeah, range versus range, irrespective of what your hand is, she made the right fold, and I think that's some consolation to her. I also think she interpreted your speech play and play acting as making it more likely you're in the stronger part of your range. People generally aren't composed enough to be able to look that relaxed when they're bluffing.
Oh, interesting. Well, we might save some of the physical read stuff for another lesson, but for now, thank you so much, Dara, for that analysis.
Thanks, David.